And I want us to think about these things for just a few moments, just reviewing just the overall picture. So number one, we have chapters 1 through 3, and that's a couple of things that remember those pivotal points that we need to keep in mind. Then we also have the fact that Revelation is an occasional material, and then the martyr theme throughout, which you'll find the passages listed on the page that was given you. So that's what we're thinking about. So let's back up and just review a couple of items here. Remember chapter 1 through 3, tells us about has two signal points in it. Number one, when these prophecies are to occur. And that's something that many people miss, is right here he tells us that soon come to pass, shortly come to pass, and these things are at hand. And those are the languages, or that's the language that is used in that chapter, in those verses. The same thing in the end of it, 22, 6 through 10. And so we have 2 points. Number one, when these prophecies will occur, and he declares, number two, how we should interpret these. And what's the signal, or the primary word that we have here, telling us how the prophecies are to be interpreted. And he tells us right here, here's how you're going to do it. When you come into my book, you open up the room, you come into the vestibule, and when you come to the vestibule, which is chapters 1 through 3, he says, when you go into the auditorium now, which is the rest of the book, I'm telling you, number one, these things are to transpire soon, shortly to come to pass, and here's how to interpret them. I'm giving you the key. You know what? We come to the book frequently, and John has left the key to the front door right there on the stand. And we just, many people just kind of break into it and just go in and we ignore the keys. He tells us the keys. So what's the key here? How these prophecies are to be interpreted is the word sign. Signs and symbols. He says these are signified by his angel to his servant John. So there's signs, signifies. It's all in signs, symbols. And so let's not forget, shortly to come to pass, when, and it's to be signs and symbols. And let's not fall into the trap of the premillennialists and the millennialists today who are all over the religious landscape telling us these things are literal and here's no. So that's number one. Any comment on that before we move on? Number two, something that I want us to feel, at least in chapters 2 and 3, is that the Revelation material is occasional material. It's occasional. What does that mean? And what do I mean when I say it's occasional? What does it mean when the letters, so you read someone saying, okay, let's look at the book of Colossians. And I've been studying Colossians. We're going to do Colossians as soon as I finish with the parables, Lord willing. And all right, Colossians was written as occasional literature. What does that mean, occasional? Exactly. It fits, she pointed out, it fits for a certain time and place. It's exactly right. It's written to an occasion. There's something that occurs in Colossae, or several things that are occurring, and Paul writes to address it. The same thing with Corinthians. It's occasional literature. How do you know it's occasional? Because he says, here's what you ask, and here's the answer to it. Here's the problem, here's the answer. That's an occasion. It's a specific occasion to which he is addressing all this material. It applies to us only that is as far as the answer to problems, if we have the same problem, similar problem. But it does not all apply to us. For example, Paul will write to, in the book of 1 Timothy, he will write to the elders. He'll write to men. He'll address the women. Well, is that written to all of us? No. Not unless you're a woman. So it's not, he just puts it in classes here. Here's what I have to say to the men. Here's what I have to say to the women. And he divides it up that way. So it's occasional material written to a specific situation. Revelation is that way. Now, what does it help us to keep from doing? Well, it helps us to keep from running all over creation with ideas from Revelation and taking passages and ideas and concepts and symbols and saying, no, this is happening right now and it's going on. Right. He's writing to an occasion to people who had specific questions, and the specific occasion was they're about to face persecution right now. What are you going to say about it, John? And that's how it's written. Okay, that's number 2. And number 3 is the martyr theme is found throughout. The martyr theme, that's the entire book is built around martyrdom. What is martyrdom? Right, sacrificing yourself to Christ. So I have a lot of passages listed on that particular page that I gave you, and you might just glance at these verses, and we'll just look at them very quickly. We'll run down the list, and then we'll go right into the letter. That is the letters. The first one is, of course, to Ephesus. So we have, for example, in chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. This is written to the church at Smyrna. I know your tribulation. Are they facing, that's something, there's great tribulation right there. And your poverty, but you are rich. The blasphemy of them that say they are Jews, and they are not, but they are the synagogue of Satan. Fear not the things which you are about to suffer. Right there is the occasion. Why did he write it? This is what's happening. Go to chapter 3, verse 9. Behold, now he's writing to the church at Philadelphia, I give of the synagogue of Satan, of them that say they are Jews, and they are not, but they do lie. I will make them to come and worship before your feet, to know that I have loved you. Because you did keep the word of my patience, I will also keep you from the hour of trial, which is coming upon the whole world to try them that dwell upon the earth. What is this all about? Well, it's about something that they're about to face. These people, those people that time. Chapter 6. Same theme of martyrdom. This is the 5th seal that is opened. I saw them underneath the altar, the souls of them that had been slain for the word of God and the testimony which they held. And they cried with a great voice, How long, O Master, and holy and true, do you not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? There's an occasion. That is, they were murdered for Christ. All right, chapter 11, verses 7 and 8. When they have finished their testimony, speaking about the 2 witnesses that he introduced in verse 3, the beast that shall come up out of the abyss shall make war with them and overcome them and kill them, and their dead bodies shall lie in this great city, street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt. So we have martyrdom. That's the highlight here. Let's go down to verse 11 of the same chapter. After the 3 days and a half, the breath of life of God will enter into them, and they stood upon their feet. And great fear fell upon them that beheld them. And they heard a great voice from heaven saying, Come up here. And they went up to heaven in the cloud, and their enemies beheld them. Verse 13, in that hour there was a great earthquake. 1/10 part of the city fell. And there were killed in the earthquake several thousand persons. The rest were affrighted and gave glory to the God of heaven. Verse 18, nations were wroth. The wrath came, the time of the dead to be judged. The time to give the reward to thy servants, the prophets, and to the saints, and to them that fear the name, the small and great, and to destroy them that destroy the earth. There are people who are destroying the land right now. And remember, the word earth is the same as land. And the people are destroying it. Anyway, you can see how that runs throughout. Let's just jump down to another one. Let's skip some of these. Let's go down to chapter 14 and verses 11 and following, where he has those people who've been persecuting the church. He says, the smoke of the torment goes up forever and ever. They have no rest day and night, they that worship the beast and his image, and whoso receives the mark of his name. And here's the patience, that is the perseverance of the saints, they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. He's writing to people there he's telling them, here is the goal. Keep the faith. That's because they're in persecution. So we'll come all the way down here to chapter 19, verse 2 for a moment. Let's go to 19 and 2. Kind of summarizing it. This is the true and righteous are his judgments, for he has judged the great harlot, her that corrupted the earth with her fornication. And he has avenged the blood of his servants at her hand. Well, people were being murdered, and he's avenging them, and that's happening in the 1st century. So that's how the book of Revelation has the martyrdom theme running throughout it. And so that's referring to martyrs of the 1st century. Is it applicable to us? Well, it would be if we're martyred. And there are passages, there are issues in the book of Revelation that are applicable to us, and there are passages that are applicable to us, but only insofar as we match the same context. So that's how Revelation is laid out. All right, anything that you want to mention on that? Any comments? All right, let's turn our attention now. This is the last chart I have up here. Let's look at the text here. Specifically, we're in chapter 2 now, and we'll begin at verse 1. And these are the letters to the churches, and there are 7 churches. No, that's not the last chart, by the way. Here's another one. Here it is. Here are the 7 churches of Asia, and the first of them is introduced in chapter 2 and verse 1. Now, this is a picture of the Aegean Sea, as you can see it, and the Mediterranean is on the bottom. So everybody just kind of orient ourselves quickly to the map. Mediterranean Sea, Israel's over to the right, and Italy will be over to the left, the boot, and the island of Sicily, all that's over to the left. Right here, coming down on the left side of this map, is Greece. And between Greece and Asia is the Aegean Sea. The 7 churches that John addresses are all on the western coast of Asia. And that would be, of course, Asia Minor. So it's kind of interesting because he follows really a postal route. And the route goes from Ephesus, he's going to go to Smyrna, Pergamum, then back down Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. So he's going up and loop, and that's a postal route. And he follows that route. And that's how he begins it. If you'll notice in chapter 2 and verse 1, the first church that he addresses is Ephesus. Yes, sir?
There have to be other churches around. Why were these there?
Well, David asked, there had to be other churches around. Why just these? Well, it perhaps was the case that there were other churches around. Now, in that particular area, I'll say this, that many people take the early date of Revelation based upon, I think Ray and I were visiting about this the other day, take the date of Revelation to be early because at that time there were only 7 churches in Asia, in the province of Asia. I didn't utilize that argument myself because I was not certain about it. I was not sure if that be the case or not. But some have argued that that was exactly the case, and there were only 7 churches at the time in the 60s when it was written. In Asia, that would be, and that area right there is just Asia. Now, the whole peninsula is called Asia Minor. It's all part of the Asian continent, but in that province, which is a Roman state of Asia, that's where those 7 churches are. There were other churches. If you scoot over, you're going to go into Cilicia, you're going to go into other provinces on the same Anatolian peninsula, or rather, same Asian peninsula. So you'll see other provinces there, but as far as the Roman province of Asia is concerned, it may be that they were the only 7 churches. And that may be. I don't know. There may have been other churches, and these were the only ones that John addressed, knowing that they would share the information with others as well. I don't know, that may be the case too. So, but that's the only way I know to answer that. Any other thoughts on that? So the first one that he addresses is Ephesus. So let's look at the text of Ephesus very quickly, the text of Revelation, rather, that is written to Ephesus. And you'll notice that John uses different figures of speech that are utilized in the first chapter. So he sets you up in the first chapter, remember the vision of Christ, and how he tells it all about, for example, in chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, he tells him to write the things which you saw, the things which are, the things which shall come to pass hereafter, and the mystery of the 7 stars which you saw in my right hand. And then he tells us, and the 7 golden candlesticks, but the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 candlesticks are 7 churches. So the stars are the angels of the churches, and the candlesticks represent the churches. So there's right away he's telling us here, these are signs and symbols. So here's how he's going to do it. In every letter, he's going to bring out some of the material that he's used describing Christ to make the letter. So here's how he begins it. These things saith he that holds the 7 stars in his right hand, and that walks in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks. All right, the 7 stars will be the angels to the churches. I take it as simply a figurative representation of the church. The 7 candlesticks are that as God walks, Christ walks among the candlesticks. He walks among the churches, just as he's walking among us today. I know your works, your toil, your patience, that you cannot bear evil men. You did try them that call themselves apostles, and they are not, and did find them false. And you hast patience, did bear for my name's sake, and has not grown weary. But I have this against you, that you did leave your first love. Remember therefore whence you are fallen, that is from the place where you came from, and repent and do the first works, or else I come to you and I will move your candlestick out of your place, except you repent. But this thou hast, that you hated the works of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. And he that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith to the churches. To him that overcomes, to him I will give to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. All right, so let's talk about Ephesus for just a moment. Thinking about it, there's a lot of interesting things about Ephesus, and I'm tempted to kind of look at much of the material, but it is really one of the chief cities of the entire region at that time. And as you know, the city of Ephesus, where Paul spent 3 years preaching. And at that time, he apparently ranged out and also established other churches. I'm thinking Colossae. For example, Colossae was going to be in this area too, but it was not mentioned in Revelation. Colossae was one of the churches that Paul, I think, established. So Paul was there preaching, and so that's how the gospel spread primarily in Ephesus. At that time, the Gulf which is the Aegean Sea, and had a gulf. You can see there's a little inlet right there, went all the way up to the very city of Ephesus. Today, it's about 7 miles away. What happened? Well, sediments have poured into it and have clogged it all up. And so now, if you're going to go to Ephesus, you're going to land, the ship's going to stop about 7 miles out from this ancient city, and you're going to walk in or ride in. But in that day, it came all the way up to the city. And there is also, it's pretty fascinating to read and study, to think about it, but there's one particular building that was there that we need to remember, and that was what? What was there in Ephesus? What was in Ephesus that really one of the ancient wonders of the world is what it was, along with the temple in Jerusalem? Anybody know? Well, it was the great temple of Diana of the Ephesians. And the temple of Diana really destroyed many years later. I think I jotted it down when, but they've discovered some portions of it. It's called the Artemision. It was burned by fire in 356 BC, rebuilt to a magnificent scale. It was the largest structure in the Hellenistic world. Most of it was entirely marble. It measured 361 feet long, 180 feet wide, sitting on a platform. And it was just really a grand temple to paganism. And it was there to commemorate the false goddess Artemis or Diana of the Ephesians. So what does that say about what we have in the New Testament? Well, there's a lot that swirls around that in Acts 19. So when Paul's preaching there, and then he's taken to the theater. And the theater's still there. The theater's still right there. It's just a great big amphitheater, and it's on a street called the Arcadian Street. And you go up the Arcadian Street, and the amphitheater's there, and there was a huge crowd there, and they were calling for the blood of Paul because he was saying there are no gods such as Diana of the Ephesians. And what was the problem there? Why were they concerned about it? Not simply because they worshiped the god, but financially. What were they concerned about financially? Well, it was a great, number one, is a great source of revenue. You came over there and you spent a lot of money in Ephesus as a tourist or as really a devotee to the religion. But also, they made false gods, small images of Diana, and remember Demetrius, the silversmith, actually made images of Diana, and they sold them. And he was part of a guild, a trade of the silversmiths, and he was all upset about it. So he started with this trade union. They began this riot. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Well, they had trade unions starting a riot, and they wanted to have Paul in the theater, and he was going to go in. and talk to them. A huge crowd, thousands of people. And his friends, we're told, said, no, no, you're not going in there. If you go in there, they're going to kill you. That's how riotous they were. So Paul did not go in upon that occasion, but they took him out. And we're told that the people that took him out were Asiarchs. His friends were Asiarchs. Who are Asiarchs? They were city officials in the city of Ephesus. Now that's the background of Ephesus. And so Paul establishes a church here in Ephesus, writes a letter to the Ephesians later. It's in our New Testament. So that's the background to it. All right, any thoughts about that? The whole point is that it's all devoted to idol worship. Idol worship, and that's what's going on in Ephesus. So let's think about how the text runs here. He tells us he's tried those who call themselves apostles, and they are not, and he finds them false. What significance might you find in that particular statement? He tries them that call themselves apostles. Well, there were people who mimic apostolic authority in the first century. But I think the significance, at least in my mind, is that it does show an early date for Revelation, because by the time of 70, when the Jerusalem was destroyed, practically, not all, but practically all of the apostles, as far as we know from secular history, were killed, martyred. Do you know, every apostle had a martyr's death, every one of them. They died, they paid with their blood the things that they preached. Except John, the one who writes this book. John, the story is told that John was taken, and they were going to put him in a pot of boiling oil, and he somehow escaped that. But he lived to be an old man, and he was taken to the church house or to the assembly house and on a stretcher, and he was able to come in on a pallet. Be that as it may, it's all secular history. It's outside the New Testament, so it's not inspired history. But that's the history of the apostles. So what point are we making? Well, they call themselves apostles, but they're not. Seemingly fits better into a scenario that Revelation was written prior to 70 than it would be many years later, because there were no apostles except John at that particular time. So that's one thing to note. They claimed authority. Now, we have people claiming the same type of thing today, authority of apostleship, but they don't show the signs of an apostle. Remember, Paul said you have to have the signs of an apostle, 2 Corinthians 12:12. They have no signs of an apostle. So that's one thing. And he said, you tried them. How did they try them? I don't know exactly. I don't know how they did that. But they tried them that call themselves apostles, and they found them false. But he says, I have this against you. They've left their first love. All right. How is that? Well, they apostatized. I suppose they grew cold in their love in some respects, and they were in apostasy. So they've left their first love. So he wants them, verse 5, to remember whence you are fallen, that is where you've come from, and repent and do the first works, or else I come to you and I will move your candlestick out of its place. All right, here's a coming of the Lord that is a figurative coming, and it's conditional, right? What's it conditioned upon? Here's a coming of Jesus Christ. Is it the second coming? No. He says it's conditional. What's it conditional upon? You're right. If they repent, I'm not coming. If you don't repent, I'm going to come and I'm going to move the candlestick. I'm going to come. There's a figurative coming of the Lord to remove the candlestick from its place, which means the church has completely apostatized, and it's not a church that God counts in His fellowship. That's obviously what it means. And it's a figurative coming of the Lord. It does show us also that it's possible to apostatize and lose the candlestick of the church, that is, removed it out of its place by God. And the church is not what it ought to be. Now let's say today we go back to Ephesus and we find the church there. Does that mean it's the same church as it was back then? And let's say we can trace the genealogy of it all the way back, and the people that are there in the church at Ephesus can tie their bloodlines all the way back to the first century church at Ephesus. Does that mean it's a faithful church today? No, no, it doesn't. It doesn't matter about your bloodline. It doesn't matter at all. And that's something we need to keep in mind, because a lot of churches of Christ in the land think, well, you know what, this goes back to the Restoration Movement and the faithful people of God. Well, they're not what they are, or not what they were then, today. They're not today what they were back then. They've moved drastically from one place to the other. And that's exactly the case. You can go to many places where the church, you can read, for example, in the days of N.B. Hardeman, they established great churches in Tennessee and Texas, and you can read about those churches and what the great work they were doing, and you say, well, let's go visit that church today. Well, you're going to be shocked. They're not what they were then, because the candlestick has been removed at further apostasy. So that's what we have with the people at Ephesus. Are any thoughts about that? It's a figurative coming, and that's the point I want us to think about. Removing the candlestick. All right, any other thoughts? Say again.
Are the lampstands and
Candlestick? Yes, it is. Lampstand is the same as the candlestick. I'm going to remove that lampstand. I'm going to remove that candlestick. Yeah, that's the same thing. You know what? I saw this comment by one writer, and I wanted to read it to you. I thought, well, he is really sharp on this. I appreciated him at least on it. He said they were not criticized for being too orthodox. They're not criticized for being too orthodox, but forsaking the first love. The question of doctrine versus love is, biblically speaking, a non-issue. In fact, it is specifically a pagan issue, seeking to put asunder what God has joined together, that is, love and doctrine. Christians are required to be both orthodox, that is, doctrinally sound, and loving, and a lack of either will eventually result in the judgment of God. It's possible that you can be loving, but you leave the doctrine of Christ, and you need both of them, love and doctrine, so you can apostatize on either one of those. And so let's not divide those up. That's the common practice today. You know, we want to separate doctrine and love. That cannot be done really biblically speaking. All right, let's think about another line here, and that is, there are people here whom he identifies as what? People, he says, they've tolerated these individuals. Nicolaitans. Works of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. Who are the Nicolaitans? Well, we're not certain, really. Some false teachers. It's interesting, some have pointed out that the wording here is exactly the same as the Hebrew word for Balaam, which you'll find those who have the teaching of Balaam in a church here, which is coming up in Pergamum. So it may be the same group of people, we're not certain, but whatever it is, that they had the works of the Nicolaitans there, and he says, I hate them. There's also an interesting thought, and that is Christ has love, but he also has hate, and he hates the works, not the people, but the works of the Nicolaitans. Whatever doctrines they were teaching, he says, I hate them. So then we have, finally, verse 7, he that has an ear to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And then I'm going to give him to eat of the tree of life, which is the paradise of God. Figurative language that you'll find opening up to you at the very last of the book of Revelation. Eat of the tree of life. Actually, those who are faithful Christians have access to the tree of life. And that's exactly the case as it is now. We have access to the tree of life. Tree of life is what? Where does that come from? Genesis, Garden of Eden. And that day, the tree of life was, of course, a literal tree. But now, spiritually speaking, the tree of life is, partaking of the fruit of it, is eternal life. And we do that by ingesting His Word. And so we have a spiritual tree of life is what it is. So that's where it comes from. All right, any thoughts about Ephesus? We kind of just touched a couple of high points. Didn't really delve into all of it that we could go to. Matter of fact, I had done so much background on some of these churches and the geography of it, the archaeology. They've uncovered all these fabulous buildings that really give color to what we know about what we have right here. But I didn't want to bog us down with that as much as I love to do things like that. Okay, let's go to the church at Pergamum. So you'll see, Smyrna. Smyrna is verse 8. So we're just going to go up the coastline to Smyrna. And let's take a glance at it real quickly. It's 35 miles north of Ephesus. It's right on the coastline. And that day it had a population, or the Greco-Roman period had a population of 100,000 people. Pretty remarkable, isn't it? And they had a harbor also that is silted up. So today there's a Turkish town there called Izmir, and it conceals almost all of the remains of Smyrna. So Izmir is what Smyrna is today. This is kind of interesting also that it has a lot of history, connection with history. For example, Homer had spent time here. Who's Homer? Great writer. Yeah, he wrote the Odyssey and so forth, Iliad. Homer spent time here. They have a great altar to Zeus that was right here, and they've uncovered all these things. They've been able to pull away the debris and find this altar. So that's what we have in Smyrna. All right, let's start the letter here, verse 8. These things saith the first and the last, who is dead and lived again. All right, that would be Christ, identifying himself by language that we have in chapter 1. First and the last, that would be Alpha and the Omega, dead and lived again. I know your tribulation. You notice that word tribulation again? I hear people talk all the time about tribulation that's coming. Well, this tribulation is already going on right here. They're already facing it. And it's tribulation, it's persecution. Your poverty, but you are rich. And the blasphemy of them that say they are Jews, and they are not, but the synagogue of Satan. Fear not the things which you are about to suffer. Now, I'm thinking, if I was sitting in that church, and let's say it was just that, John would write to us today in Iowa Park and say, all right, don't be fearful about the things you're about to suffer. You know, I think everybody would be paying attention. What are you talking about? You're about to suffer some things. And not talking about just, the ills of this life and so forth. He's talking about persecution. Behold, the devil is about to cast some of you into prison, that you will be tried, and you shall have tribulation 10 days. I take it 10 days is simply a figurative expression for a short period of time. But I want you to be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. And he that has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He that overcomes, he shall not be hurt of the second death, which I take to be, according to Revelation 20, that is eternal death. That is, you have to overcome in order to escape the second death. That is eternal punishment. All right, let's think about a couple of things that are mentioned here. Number one, he tells us in verse 9, very simply, that the people who are responsible for their tribulation includes the Jews. Now that's amazing. And he says the blasphemy of them that say they are Jews, but they are not. And they have a synagogue. And he calls it the synagogue of Satan. A couple of interesting things here. We say, well, John is the apostle of love because he writes, for example, the book of 1 John. He talks about loving one another. But here he calls synagogues of Jews synagogues of Satan. Now, I'm going to ask you, if preachers were to speak that way today, I just wonder how much they would be tolerated. There's the churches over there, the church of Satan. Oh, no, that's a denominational church. No, that's the church of Satan. That's a synagogue over there. They're all meaning well. They're going to the synagogue, but it's the synagogue of Satan. Well, that's how John talks. That's number one to think about. Number two, it's interesting that they claim to be Jews. He says they're really not the Jews. They claim to be Jews, but they're not. Now, there's not anyone in the first century going to be claiming to be a Jew who's really not a Jew, because they would be able to discern whether that person was actually a Jew or not. What's he mean by this then? Well, they're bloodline Jews, maybe so, but they are synagogue of Satan. The real Jews are who? Christians are God's Jews. That is a message that our world does not seem to understand. And the religious world is just as culpable as the rest of the communities on thinking that Jews are Jews and they're God's people and Christians are Christians. No, Christians are God's Jew. He tells us that in Romans chapter 2, 28 and 29. He tells us that in Galatians 6 and verse 16. He tells us that in Philippians chapter 3, verses 1 and following. He tells us that continually throughout the New Testament that Christians are God's Jews, so to speak. not literally bloodline. And the Jews that are there have already had, we might say, the candlestick removed, and they're the synagogue of Satan. So that's another interesting lesson right there, isn't it? Here's something else to think about. Once again, it's a pointer to the fact that the book was written before 70. It would be hardly the case after Judaism was completely wiped out, almost completely, in Palestine and throughout the empire, that people want to claim to be Jews. No, they were persecuted. And Judaism was knocked out in 70. As a matter of fact, it can never be revived. Now, it can never be revived because all of the bloodlines records were completely destroyed. So that was all done. So this is an indicator that the book was written prior to 70. There's a synagogue there. They claim to be Jews. They're not. Christians are God's Jews. And we need to note that. But that is a doctrine that is not very well received in the religious world. Why? Why do you suppose that is? It seemed pretty plain in the New Testament, passages we mentioned as well as others. Why is that not very well received? Think about that for a moment. Yeah, I think that gets a lot to it. He said the Jewish state has to be restored in order for premillennialism to be, not to be true, but in order for premillennial doctrine to be accepted, they say, okay, Jewish state has to be restored. Most people in religion, in denominationalism, believe that God's chosen people are still the Jews. They say that, they believe that, they preach it, and if you were to say anything contrary-wise, you are anathema. And that is exactly the truth. So denominationalism is riddled with error, but that's one of the primary errors, and that is they still believe that God's chosen people are the Jews. In the New Testament, such as passages like these show us they're not the true Jew. They're the synagogue of Satan. All right, so there's something else to think about. All right, any other thoughts on it, comments? And go ahead, David.
You said the harbors were filled in. What made the harbors fill in?
You know, those were, the harbors were filled in simply by the tides that roll in, and they bring sand and silt up into the harbor. And so even in the first century, the Roman emperors had to have vast engineering teams that would go in and clean out the harbors, clean them out in order that they might be able to be utilized, such as Ephesus, Smyrna, and the record is very clear that they had, not only in the first century, but in the second century, third century, the emperors would have to have engineers go in and clean out the harbor in order that they might be able to come up to it. And that's what they did, because that affected the commerce and the trade. And they wanted to have harbor towns. Yeah, that's right. They had to be dug out. Well, the harbors had to be dug out. They're dredged.
What filled the cities and what covered the cities?
Well, there was debris that covered the cities. Still, same thing, but not silt in the harbor. But there was debris that covered the ancient cities, and many of those ancient cities are simply mounds today, just mounds. And so you have to dig down. And the trouble is many modern cities are built on top of the ancient cities that were just buried beneath the hundreds and hundreds of years of sand and dirt and silt that came up on the city. And so they built the modern city on top of it. So to go back and discover some of that is very, very challenging to try to get down in there and say, you know, your house is built on an old house. I want to dig through your floor. You can't do that. So that's why some of it's very limited. So that's I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that kind of is how things are laid out, what happens.
They didn't just fill it with trash and all that. It was a natural thing.
It was a natural thing, right. It had nothing to do with trash of people. As far as I know, it's a natural thing. I don't know if anybody knows any more about that, but I'm happy for you to speak up if you know how that happened really, but it's the sediment just comes in through the tides and piles up, and now it's 7 miles, Ephesus, 7 miles from the harbor. And that's 7 miles worth of sediment. So, but in those days, it was all the way up to the city. You could float up to the city, and you could see, at the harbor, you could see a gigantic temple of Artemis at Ephesus. You can see it right there. And it would be lit up at night. It had fires burning around it. And it was pretty magnificent to see. Yo, yeah. I should have felt that one coming. That was good. Climate change has caused it all to, that's right. Go to the sand. So that's how the harbors were in that time, and it was a continual operation to try to keep them cleaned out. That's right. So today, and that's why also people, you think, okay, here's a harbor town on the coastline of Israel. There's a couple of harbor towns. Well, why this town? Why that town? Well, because they look for a natural harbor. What would be a natural harbor?
One that's already on the... Deep enough.
Deep enough. It'd have to be deep enough, so they would have to have a rocky cliff, frequently a rocky cliff going down into it, and just it's deep enough as you come up to the land that you can bring a ship up. Because most of those places have a shelf going out like that. The water comes up and the shelf goes down like this. Well, you can't bring a ship up like that. So they had to have a natural harbor. And so they made artificial harbors by digging it out. How they did all of that, I'm not sure how the engineers figured all that out, but they did. And Caesarea is one example of it. They made a harbor out of a city that's really not a natural harbor. And Herod the Great did that. You can still see the remains of his breakwater reaching out into the sea. It's still right there. If you have a picture of aerial view of Caesarea, you can see the breakwater reaching out into the sea, and it used to have buildings on it, and the ships would come in, and they would stay in that harbor. But now, of course, the buildings are gone. There's maybe a tower or one or here too, but you can see these arms reaching out into the sea, and that's how they did it, built a harbor. Any other thoughts on it? All right, well, we expanded our time. I wanted to get through 4 churches. We got through 2. Next week, we'll just continue with the letters to the 7 churches. If you have questions about it, we can write them down, bring out to our attention some of the things you might want to ask. This is not for me to dominate and say, you accept my views on it. If you have another view on a particular line or verse, I'm happy to hear you on it. And we'll plow through that. Then we're going to get to chapters 4 and 5, which is setting up for the first major vision, which is the coming of the 7 horses and the 7 riders. And we'll see how that goes in chapter 6. All right, thank you for your participation.